Hi class! This week we're building on our exploration skills by talking about skills for exploring thoughts, content, and narratives. Now, a major focus in the exploration stage is, of course, emotional activation, but we need to get at people's thinking around things. We need to understand how people see things, and sometimes it's a little easier to start with people's thoughts because that can feel more comfortable. But another thing that I want to highlight that I think can be really helpful to you as you work in the stage is thinking about that narrative piece. Everyone has a story, and a part of going through life is understanding our own stories and being able to tell our story to ourselves. I think a beautiful part of life is that we can all live in such different stories and yet we're all kind of coexisting, but we are the main character in our own story. And it can be really insightful to get a sense of how someone is telling their story. It can say a lot about who they are, how they think about themselves, how they relate to other people, how they see their strengths, how they see their weaknesses, etc. So when you're getting to know someone in the exploration stage, you want to be listening for, again, who is this person, what is their story, and how do they see themselves in that story? And so with these skills, we're really just trying to, again, build on what we know of creating a safe place for them, using good attending and listening skills. Those listening skills are going to be very key foundation for doing a lot of these skills. And so we're creating that space, we're listening, we're attending. This is where we use some verbal skills to help them really explore. Have they explored the complexities of their issues or for whatever reason why they're coming to get help? A lot of times when people are getting help, there are a lot of different pieces at play, and we need to understand those different pieces to be effective helpers. Have they explored their thoughts enough to identify larger themes? As it talks about in the book, sometimes our feelings and thoughts when we're going through something stressful can be such a jumble, and it can be really helpful to talk to someone and have a space where you can pull out those things bit by bit and explore them and maybe see how they fit together in a larger picture. And again, we're trying to use these skills to help them share their story so that they can make better sense of it. That is another key piece. We are, of course, going to learn a lot listening to other people, but the point of listening is not for us to be entertained. It's so that other people can hear themselves, have a sense of their own story, and make better sense of it. So the skills that we're going to be looking at are restatements, summaries, open-ended questions and probes for thoughts, and some limited closed questions. And I'm going to emphasize the limited closed questions, and a lot of assignments you're going to have in this class, you will really not need to use closed questions, but these could be something that you use in your various helping professions, and so we'll discuss those a little bit. The first skill is a restatement. This is just a nice little building block skill that can be used in all kinds of situations and all kinds of conversations. And a restatement is really repeating or rephrasing the content or meaning of what a client has said to you. Sometimes giving a restatement is also called paraphrasing, so you may see that language in the book, or you also may be in another helping skills class and kind of see that difference. Knowing the technical differences is not that important in this class. What is important is that you understand how to give restatements and paraphrasing and what it can do in a helping relationship. Restatements, they often use the same language as the client. We could also call that parroting language, where paraphrases or paraphrasing often involves the helper adding their own spin, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. General tips. These should be short. They should be concrete summaries of what the client has said. And when I say summaries, I mean you're summarizing something they've said, but it needs to be a little nugget. Later we'll talk about summaries, the formal skill of summaries, which can refer to summarizing a larger chunk of the conversation and overall general themes. But restatements are short little pieces that you're giving back to the client. The intentions of this is to clarify what the client is saying and to show that you're paying attention. It can also be important to make sure that you're on the same page with clients, and restatements and really many of these skills, when you're kind of showing the client how you're tracking with them, it also provides an opportunity for them to correct you if you're perceiving something differently than what they're trying to communicate. And that's really important. It's really important that you don't get in your head that you have to be completely perfect in all of these skills and statements. You want to listen, and someone's going to notice if you're not listening and your stuff is all over the place. But as long as you're listening and doing your best, it's okay if the client is kind of coming back and kind of clarifying back at you that maybe you need to see that a little differently. And that's good because that's the actual helping process. Remember, this is a joint venture helping, so we want the client engaged and willing to speak up and say if we're right or not. And again, it also has a goal for the client when you give restatements and a lot of these skills, because again, you're helping them better understand their thoughts through their verbal processing. There's something about helping that can be like a mirror or a speaker back to people. It's helpful for us to maybe sometimes hear what we're saying through other people. So let's look at this. There are several ways to introduce a restatement or a paraphrase, such as, I hear you saying, it sounds as though, you're saying that, if I'm hearing you accurately, and there are more examples of that in 135. But here's what I'd say. You don't always have to open them up with these little statements. If someone were to say, for example, my dog died yesterday, if they're feeling really emotional about it, I might even just say a simple, your dog died. And notice I'm using my tone very softly, and that can be a little restatement, and it can encourage them to say more. But if someone is talking about something that's maybe not as emotionally impactful, and I'm not totally sure, I might be like, am I hearing you saying that you're really frustrated with your parents right now? Is that accurate? So sometimes it's important to be a little bit tentative, which is what these kind of examples are, because they kind of show, I think I'm hearing you, but I need you to let me know, and that's okay. As I said before, when we're giving restatements or paraphrases, you can use parroting, where you use the exact same words as the client, or you can use your own words. And again, those own words are going to be formulated by good listening. So if the client were to say, lately I've noticed that I don't really want to talk to anyone. I just want to go home, make dinner, go to bed, but my roommates want me to hang out, but I feel like I just have nothing to give them. Right? This is someone that seems a little exhausted. We would obviously want to get to, what is causing that exhaustion. But in that moment, we want to kind of restate what we've heard them say. So a parroting example would be, lately it feels like you don't want to talk to anyone. Because that's almost exactly what they just said. I don't really want to talk to anyone. Using your own words, a different way to say that could be, you don't have a lot of energy for other people right now. Those are not exact words that they said, but it matches the content of what they're expressing. So let's look at some examples. The client comes in and says, my parents have been married for 25 years, and suddenly they've decided that they don't want to be married anymore. The helper could give a restatement saying, you're saying that your parents are getting divorced? The client could say, not yet, but they want a trial separation, but divorce is certainly possible. Now notice, what did the helper try to restate? They get to the most important part, or that cutting edge. When you're listening to clients, you want to make kind of thoughtful choices around what seems like the most prominent issue here. And again, those would largely be related to, I always listen for big life changes, where there might be big emotions involved, etc. Kind of things that look like they could be, causing change in the client's life. And so when the helper says, your parents are getting divorced, that should be spoken slowly and supportively, not your parents are getting divorced or your parents are getting divorced, right? We don't want to enter those kinds of tones into our helping conversation. Notice it's also simple. The helper is not trying to say something overly complex. And also, as I said before, restatements give the clients opportunity to clarify their narratives. And that's what the client did. Oh, not yet, but they want a trial separation, but divorce is certainly possible. So restatements are a skill that you can use in everyday conversation, and I encourage you to try them out. Now, summarizing is a kind of restatement, but as I said before, it kind of refers to a much larger chunk of a helping interaction. This is a restatement where you pick out the highlights or themes of what a client has said over a space of time. Maybe that's something that you've been talking about with a client for the last 10-15 minutes. Maybe that is something that you want to do. It's good to do these actually at the end of sessions to make sure you kind of override what did we talk about today. That gives clients an opportunity to kind of sit with things and think about things as they leave. But some tips. Summaries do not include interpretation, so it's not us taking a moment to give our own thoughts and interpretations on that. They are a summarizing of what has been said, what has happened. Interpretations are going to be saved for the insight stage, which we'll get to after the exploration stage. The helper intentions with a summary is to, again, clarify the big picture that is coming together in their mind, to share what they're hearing overall, and it also helps clients see core themes in their thoughts. So let's give an example. So let's say that helper before had kept working with this client, and they were talking about their experiences of kind of watching their parents separate, and they're starting to feel that that experience is affecting how they see relationships in the present. So the client could say, I'm starting to wonder if relationships are all a hoax. I told you about my own issues with my breakups in the past, but I held out hope because my parents had this great relationship. Everything feels too crazy right now. I find myself wondering if I can ever trust someone to be there for me long term. So the helper, this is, would come after they've had a conversation for a while. So to summarize, it sounds like your parents' marriage really influenced how you see relationships. Now that they're separating, you wonder if a long-term relationship can work for anyone. And the client would say, yeah, I suppose so. Now, taking exactly what this says as a summary, it does kind of summarize what the client just said, but it's intended to, again, summarize a longer chunk of conversation. And if this client came in talking about their parents getting divorced, and now they're doubting their own relationships, this would be a very appropriate skill. So, again, benefits of restatements and summaries, they help clients kind of see and hear themselves because the helpers are serving as mirrors or sounding boards to clients. Another thing is that clients will repeat thoughts and feelings that are important to them, but they might not be aware of it. So we'll talk more about feelings next week, but if clients keep repeating something, whether that's a feeling or a thought, something they're experiencing, when they keep repeating something, that's important, and that tends to be something that I like to pick up on. And as I said, clients and restatements and summaries can help the client hear their own words reflected back, and they might also, again, realize what really matters to them in the process, because sometimes what really matters to us, we don't always explicitly know that in the moment, and conversation helps. All right, restatements and summaries, usable, everyday skills. Now, open questions and probes for thoughts. Now, questions are bread and butter of a helper, but learning how to ask good questions takes work. And I would offer that to start by asking good questions, learn how to ask open questions. And probes go along with it, so let's tease that out. So these are verbal skills used to ask client to clarify or explore thoughts. And so starting with open-ended questions, what makes an open-ended question? An open-ended question, it cannot be answered with a yes or no response, whereas a closed question can. And we'll talk about closed questions in a moment. But again, we want to largely avoid those in this class, and we want to limit those in helping interactions. Open-ended questions, and I'll go back to that and kind of go back to tips. But open-ended questions, again, these are thoughts that are they're open because the client has to say more than a one-word answer to respond. And so as a result of asking open questions, people tend to do a lot more exploring as they're talking, and it also keeps the conversation going. Asking too many closed questions has a way of kind of shutting the conversation down. So here are some ways to start open-ended questions. Things like, what are your thoughts about? What do you mean by that? What comes to mind when you think about blank? When you hear blank, what comes to mind? And again, these are open-ended questions for thoughts. Next week we'll talk about open-ended questions for feelings, but it's a very similar premise. It's a question that, again, is formulated to ask about a thought, ask about experience, and can't be answered yes or no. Probes are kind of like they sound, they're almost like probes to be like, hey, can you tell me more about that? But again, we don't want to point at clients, but they kind of have like an emotional, like a little emotional poke, like, hey, could you tell me more about that? Or could you give me an example of that? Or can you say more about that? Probes are particularly helpful when it sounds like something they're saying is important and we want them to kind of go into it a bit more, either so that we can better understand and often so they can also better understand. And there are more examples of this on page 140. Now back to a couple of hints. When you're using question and probes, they're very, very useful skills, but there's some things you should keep in mind, such as first, avoid stacking multiple questions in one response, just one at a time. Sometimes new helpers will ask 3 questions in one, like, how was that with your parents? And, what was that like with your sister? And, how did that work out for you? That's way too much for clients. They just need one question, right? Second, mix it up. Switch between questions, probes, restatements, summaries, even other skills we talked about like minimal encouragers. Too many questions in a row can make a helping interaction feel like an interview and can make people feel anxious. And that goes for closed and open-ended questions. But if you're asking too many questions, it can just feel just too vulnerable and anxiety-inducing for people. So make sure that you're using these skills but switching them up. And also remember that you're focusing on the client rather than what other people the client will talk about. This is a big one. Often in helping sessions, clients will get to talking about other relationships, other experiences. It's okay to explore that, but you want to explore their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, and not get into the nitty-gritty about, other people because that person's not in the room. So you can't really, you know what I mean? They can't really represent themselves. So you want to focus on clients and not get into a rabbit hole of asking a ton of questions about someone who's not there. Focus on what that means for them. So, another thing that I would encourage you to practice is turning closed questions into open-ended questions. People in everyday life have a habit of asking a lot of closed questions. With a little bit of effort, you can make a closed question open. So here are some examples. Did you have a happy childhood? That could be answered yes or no. What was it like growing up? However, that question it just opens up more room for them to tell their story. Someone might ask, was your mother angry with you? Instead, which could be answered yes or no, how are things going with your mother? Notice also when you say, was your mother angry with you, you're kind of leading and saying that was her experience. You don't know. Just ask, how are things going? And this is an example where you could turn it into an open question that could, again, it depends on where you're trying to go in the session. So say someone was having some kind of, crisis issue and you think they need to talk to someone. You could say, have you considered talking to your roommate? That's yes or no. Turn that into an open question with, is there anyone you want to talk about this with? Right? So if someone's in crisis, one key is often we want them to let other people in and know how they're doing. Or another way you could phrase that is, what do you think would happen if you talked to your roommate? If you thought that you would want to suggest that. So let's look at some more examples. The client comes in, I'm so exhausted with trying to figure out what to do with my life. All my classes are draining and boring at the same time. I know I should just be glad to be a business major, but I hate it. Now the helper is going to ask an open-ended question, but what seems important there? They are putting a lot of pressure on being a business major. So the helper could ask, what does it mean when you say you should be glad about being a business major? The client might follow up, that's just my dad in my head. He's a CEO and makes so much money, that's all that matters to him. He doesn't care that I'm more creative. He thinks I have to be in business to succeed in life. And the helper could follow up, it sounds like you disagree with his philosophy. That would be also a restatement. But the probe here would be, tell me more, because obviously we see this is important, this is bothering him, we want him to keep talking about it. The client might go on, I feel like I'm expected to chase his dream, not mine. I'm obviously not doing well at being the son that he wants. I just don't care about this major at all. So those are some skills that you can use, open-ended questions and probes to get people talking. I've posted some other examples so you can see what that looks like. But again, practice these skills in everyday life. They will serve you very well. The last question, and again, limited use only, are closed questions. And closed questions are questions that can be answered yes or no. They're geared towards specific short answers, and these are usually used for clarification purposes. But again, they're not very exploratory, but obviously in some jobs, if you're in a healthcare role or you're something where you just need specific information, it can be appropriate to ask these types of questions. Just remember to balance them with other questions that get people sharing. So what are my hints? Again, of course, use sparingly. As I said, you can also use these to clarify the client what you've heard, and so you can ask things like, is that correct? Am I hearing you correctly? So that can be a good time to use a closed question. Closed questions are also really important in situations of crisis where you need facts. For example, if there's a client or a student that is suicidal, I have to kind of pause what I'm doing and make sure that I'm asking them certain questions. Yes or no questions such as, have you thought about hurting yourself? Have you thought about killing yourself? Do you have a plan to do that? And so if you take crisis training, you will learn more about this. And if you're going to work with populations where there could be crisis situations, make sure you get training on crisis. We have a really nice crisis intervention course here in HSR, for example. Closed questions can also be used on occasion to get more details. If your client is being vague, you're certainly going to have clients, some that talk more than others. And if the client is just not sharing, closed questions can be a way to go. Let me give you an example of what that could look like when it would be appropriate. But again, limit closed questions. So you could say, so if I am hearing a theme here that you don't really want to move to Ohio right now, is that correct? The client could just respond, yes, that's correct. So that's a way to add that closed question, which is that correct, to clarify. Another time is if a client is being repeatedly vague. And so a helper might be trying to figure out information about a client's background, and they might be really hesitant to share. So maybe the helper is saying, so tell me about your family. Notice that's an open question. The client could follow up with, we live in Kentucky. We have a house. If I hear someone talk about the fact that they have a house and we're asking about their family, I know that this client is not going to be that chatty. Okay, you live here. Can you tell me more? We've lived here for 9 years. Notice they opened up again with an open-ended question or a probe. Can you tell me more? They're still not biting. So they might start asking, are you married? Yes, to my wife Sheila. Do you have kids? Yes, Donnie and Dottie, they're twins, right? So if you have a client, again, is particularly closed off, you can ask closed questions, but try to get back to open-ended questions as soon as possible. And again, if you're working in a crisis situation, seek specialized training in how to engage with those clients in that situation. So those are the skills we're talking about today. Restatements, summaries, probes, and mostly open-ended questions. On the discussion board, you're going to be asked to have a conversation where you're asking open-ended questions, so make sure you are checking out that prompt in advance and give this a try. I look forward to hearing how that goes. Bye, guys.